Excellency, colleagues from the UN system, fellow NGO representatives, dear friends. On behalf of the NGO Committee for Social Development, it is my great honor and pleasure to welcome you all to the Civil Society Forum 2019. My name is Monica Jahangir Chaudhary, and I actually clearly remember sitting in this room 2 years ago, attending my first Civil Society Forum, and being delighted to meet so many inspiring individuals coming from all parts of the world, eager to share their concerns, yes, but most importantly, eager to share their knowledge, their expertise, their projects, their hopes and their ambitions to build a better world for all. So I hope that today you can use this space, the space of the Civil Society Forum, to connect between NGOs and to build a stronger global NGO community. I would like to take a moment to thank those who made this day possible. Special thanks to Lynn Hensler-Hirsch and Mary D'Amato-Rizzi from the Executive Committee for putting so much energy and efforts into the preparation of this day. Thank you also to all the volunteers, and including the interpreters who are interpreting for you today, and to the funders, without whom this day wouldn't be possible at all. Before we turn to our distinguished speakers, I would like to say a few words in relation to the theme of the Civil Society Forum, which is also the theme of the Commission. I know that we all know the theme by heart by now, but I will read it once again. Addressing inequalities and challenges to social inclusion through fiscal, wage, and social protection policies. Now, since the beginning of the week, we have been discussing how inequalities, be they economic or social inequalities, or inequalities in opportunities, or inequalities in outcomes. So we've been discussing how inequalities are a defining issue of our times. And I think that a very glaring example of that is just to see the number of people who are taking to the streets, how much exhausted and oppressed they are, trying to make ends meet, trying to survive, trying to ask for decent wages. So just think of the yellow jackets in France, or think of the female garments workers in Bangladesh, or think of the public sector workers on strike in Tunisia. So all those spontaneous movements are challenging the traditional structures and institutions of their countries, but also they are questioning our own capacity to carry their messages at the United Nations. How can we, civil society representatives, rethink our own capacity to pass on their grievances from the streets to the UN? I think this is a question of economic and social justice, but this is also a question of democracy. And in this view, we should also keep in mind those who are too fragile and socially isolated to protest and voice their concerns. What about those who live in such dire conditions that they have lost all political power and voices? What about those who have become invisible in the eyes of policymakers? I think this is our responsibility as the NGO global community to reach those who are most furthest behind and make sure that their interests are reflected into our advocacy here at the UN and that their participation is made possible. I'll just finish by saying that inequality and poverty are not inevitable. This is what we learn in the different high-level panels of this week. It is a matter of political choice, and ultimately those political choices reflect the kind of society we want to see for ourselves and for the future generations. Not a society that encourages division, greed, materialism, and individualism, but hopefully a society that celebrates solidarity, empathy, justice, and equity. And with that, I will now turn to our first speaker, His Excellency Ambassador Barrot from the Permanent Mission of Senegal to the United Nations. As you know, the Permanent Mission of Senegal is chairing the Commission. Ambassador Barrot will deliver his message in French, so feel free to use this for interpretation. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Thank you, Monica, for giving me the floor. I will make my statement in French. So, avant tout, je voudrais d'abord présenter les regrets de l'ambassadeur Cheikh Niang, président de la CESOCDI, qui n'a pas pu être là parce que justement il a d'autres engagements aujourd'hui au niveau donc des Nations Unies. Il m'a demandé donc de dire ces quelques mots, notamment pour souligner la valeur de la société civile au niveau des Nations Unies. Une société civile donc capable de lire la réalité sous un angle différent. Nous essayons tous de lire le monde et chaque perspective contribue assurément à notre compréhension de ce monde. Donc il faut dire que seule une lecture globale, mais aussi...
We are trying to look for the most appropriate solutions. Yes. So I was saying, I believe that these types of spaces for civil society are crucial, and we must learn together how to take advantage of these communal spaces. I would like to very briefly just underline a few important points. The importance of and the role of governments and of partnerships in order to reduce inequalities, and the importance of promoting social cohesion. That all of the societies in the world are struggling against currently. It is likewise very important to be aware of the context of the agenda that we have before us today, so that we can aim for a larger inclusion, social inclusion. Another important aspect is political will to achieve these goals for civil society. We, of course, have to focus on our common struggle to reduce inequalities and poverty. The president of the Committee for Social Development has expressed the importance of collaborating very closely across all sectors of civil society. Thank you very much.
We really appreciate the openness and willingness of your mission to work with civil society. I will now turn to our next speaker, Ms. Daniela Bass, Director of the Division for Inclusive and Social Development with UNDESA. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Your Excellency and colleagues and NGO representatives, and among you also quite a few friends, I hope. I would really like to thank the NGO committee for that supports the Commission for Social Development, as well as the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for organizing this forum. You know, I asked myself, what is social protection? Because we use this expression, but I really wanted to make sure that I understand what social protection is. And I looked at the United Nations, the definition of the given to this by the United Nations Institute of Research, based in Geneva. And UNRIST says, social protection is preventing, is managing, is overcoming situations that adversely affect people's well-being. And then I wanted to read a little bit more about the definition of social protection, looking at other literature. And it means protecting and helping people who are living in situations that can be cause of vulnerability. Could be age, could be having a disability temporarily or permanently, could be being displaced, it could be being unemployed or sick. And so I ask myself another question. How and what the private and the public initiatives can provide income, distribution of wealth, or consumption transfers to those people suffering from poverty in order to enhance their social, economic, and political status. And I think that this is what we want to discuss today in this forum. What kind of good practices are you familiar with, are you aware of, that can be brought here to the discussion? Not so much talking about the diagnosis where the problem lies, but we would be nice to find also the treatment. Now, old treatments to a new sickness, because inequality is changing its face, and it differs depending on which country we're focusing on. So if we want to call that kind of a sickness, a bacteria, what kind of medicine can we use to treat it? Because I have the feeling that we keep treating new bacteria with old medicines. So it would be interesting to know what in the laboratories, that is the NGOs, what your laboratories are seeing. If you had a chance, an opportunity to do an analysis, say, of what happened during the last 10 years, from when we were discussing about inequalities, because it was already on the table. We didn't need the 2030 agenda to start talking about inequalities. We have been talking about inequalities since the United Nations has been established, right? But definitely, because the phenomenon now is becoming so explosive, it had to be included as one of the main 17 goals the world wants to find a solution to, or at least reduce the gap of inequalities to as much as possible. So, in your laboratories, did you have a chance to do the analysis of how this bacteria has developed throughout the last 10 years? In order for, and what solutions were found meanwhile that proved to be successful? And so what is your projection based on the trend that you have analyzed for the next 10, 15 years? That's where we have to gather together here in the space given by the United Nations and start putting solutions on the table. And say, you know what? This year we're meeting here at this forum. What kind of challenge are we giving ourselves as laboratories to bring a solution and some very interesting food for thought and thought leadership next year? And presently, since we are here, how can we contribute to the success of this commission by providing advice and supporting the endeavors of member states? And maybe next year, there might be also some groups from the private sector here, because they are not NGOs, but definitely they're part of the civil society. And that's where things happen. And then we can discuss them here and try to give a frame to what has been discussed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Bass, for this call to NGOs to bring our expertise here at the United Nations. I will now turn to Ms. Bettina Louise Rurup, who is the Executive Director of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, New York. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Excellency, dear Daniela Baas, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. It's a great pleasure and also a privilege to address this distinguished gathering and to welcome you all to this year's Civil Society Forums to the 57th Commission for Social Development at the United Nations. Many of you know that the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung has been a close ally and supporter of the Civil Society Forum since the first Social Summit in Copenhagen in 1995. You might also know that the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung is a progressive think tank involved with educational and policy-oriented programs. Inspired by the core values of social democracy, freedom, justice, and solidarity, FES runs programs with offices in about 110 countries worldwide, having a very strong focus on countries in the global south. Facilitating dialogue among different stakeholders, bringing together academia and practitioners, parliamentarians and citizens, business and trade unions, civil society and governments, local organizations with national institutions, aiming at consensus building and bringing about viable solutions has been at the core of our work. In our understanding, social inclusion and real democracy go hand in hand. They are intrinsically linked to each other and one cannot have one without the other. Over the past years, the Commission on Social Development has been the place to address the challenges and gaps in social justice. In the spirit of the Copenhagen Declaration on Social Development, where member states had agreed as early as in 1995 on the need to work jointly on creating an economic, social and political environment that will enable people to achieve social development. This civil society forum has been a space to bring different dimensions of social development together at the Commission, and also to support, with the support of the 2030 Agenda and emphasizing the 17 goals of the 2030 Agenda. It has been very important, but I would say it needs to become even more important. At FES, we have been working both on the processes as well as on the substance. We have worked with the International Coalition for Social Protection Floors, a group of roughly 90 organizations which have done research and advocacy. We are also part of the SPIAC-B group, bringing together UN agencies and IFIs, as well as civil society organizations and also member states, to foster the right to universal social protection. And we're also working in many different settings with civil society, with trade unions, with business, with parliamentarians and government on wage and fiscal policies. This year's deliberations at the Civil Society Forum take place in times when international cooperation itself is under attack. Trust in multilateral agreements is waning and needs to be strengthened and made coherent with one another. Social exclusion and inequality has been on the agenda for some time now. More and more people, agencies and governments recognize the overall detrimental effect of inequalities on societies, on economies and on polities. The social fabric is fraying in many places, as also the report of the Secretary General of last November points out. Inequality is no longer just a moral or human rights issue, but also a topic for macroeconomic policies. It's very clear that we need a paradigm shift in economic and social policies to overcome the current levels of poverty, deprivation, and inequality. Universal social protection systems need to be strengthened, and as traditional informal support systems are no longer in place to counterbalance policies of neglect and exclusion. Multilateral institutions can and must play their role in coming up with inequality, reducing and social inclusion favoring policies. But governments play an indispensable role in creating and maintaining public institutions, in prioritizing public and fiscal policies, in bringing stakeholders together and working hand in hand towards the public good. Civil society organizations can be and have been important agents of change, providing a perspective from the grassroots, building capacities and empowering people in general, but particularly women, old age, youth, and those with special needs. Trade unions play an important role in voicing workers' rights and collectively bargaining for decent work and common good. Empirical evidence shows very clearly that policies such as good wage policies and enforcement of labor rights are putting an end to illicit financial flows, and setting up and broadening tax systems, for example, reduce inequalities and increase well-being and happiness overall. It's not witchcraft, as we say in Germany. It can be done, and it must be done. Let me conclude with articulating my deep appreciation for the tremendously important work carried out by all of you here. We would not be where we are right now with regard to important international agreements and achievements if it would not be for your work and engagement, empathy, and solidarity. I would also like to thank the NGO Committee for Social Development for organizing, again, this year's Civil Society Forum in a tremendously, in a very perfect way, and particularly Daniel Perel and his team. But also, I would like to thank His Excellency Abdoulaye Baro, DPR of Senegal, as well as the chair of the 57th Commission of the Social Development, and as well as the relentlessly active director of the Division for Inclusive Social Development, Mrs. Daniela Bass. I hope this Civil Society Forum works in a two-folded way, strengthening the work on the ground through exchange of expertise, mutual learning and networking, as well as feeding into the multilateral system, which needs the experience, the perspectives, and the critical support of solidarity of civil society more than ever. I would also now just briefly say that I'm very pleased to that we have Ms. Helen Modura here from the Africa Platform for Social Protection, whom we invited as a speaker to learn and benefit from her vast experience and expertise working on social protection and transformative policies. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I hand over to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Rurup, for all the work that FES supports in the world and for, of course, supporting the Civil Society Forum from the beginning. Ms. Helen Modura, a human rights defender who is currently serving as a program manager at the Africa Platform for Social Protection. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Your Excellency, sir, representatives of various departments and institutions of the United Nations, representatives of various government offices, representatives of civil society organizations, ladies and gentlemen. In order to affirm the role of civil society in promoting rights, I am reminded in 2011 when an organization I worked for hosted delegates from other countries in Africa for an exchange visit. Part of the itinerary included visiting various government ministries and institutions to understand the relationship and linkages between government and civil society organizations. Kenya had at that time enacted a new constitution. The guests had this question in almost all the visits. Why does Kenya seem to make so much progress in many areas, especially in legal and policy? Regardless of which ministry or department was asked this question, the answer, surprisingly, was the same. They all said, we have a very vibrant civil society organization. This acknowledgement by the state that things would be much slower in the absence of a strong civil society gave me faith and hope in the work that we as civil society organizations do. It made me realize that although a lot of times our governments often feel that civil society organizations are a bother, deep down their souls, they acknowledge the contribution made by this important sector. And the answer is an affirmation to this important role that we all play. In responding to some of the questions that I was asked to address, I look at what Steiner and Alston say, that civil society contributes significantly, 1, to setting standards, 2, promotion, implementation, and 3, enforcement of human rights. I see civil society organizations intervening along this path, with some organizations established to set standards, to promote rights, to provide direct services, or monitoring how these services are provided and how these rights are realized or not. In most instances, organizations will undertake a number of these thematic areas. We see interactions at community level where, in most cases, services are provided directly. However, particularly with social protection and specifically with cash transfers, which is most of what we do, we see a top-down approach where programs are designed centrally by the central government and then services are provided at the community level. What happens is that the levels of awareness of rights, levels of awareness of these programs at community level remain very low, and nobody knows who deserves to be on a government program. What are the parameters of getting onto a government program? Therefore, civil society organizations must raise awareness on rights. They must raise awareness on government programs that are being provided at community level. We should not assume that because it's a government-led program, every citizen understands or every citizen knows. Civil society also have a role to monitor what the government is doing, how the government is providing this service. For cash transfers, for example, in African context, it targets the poorest of the poor. And you know what it means to provide services to a poor person. They don't have any voice. So civil society must strengthen the voice of the poor, the marginalized, the excluded, to claim their rights. Even though cash transfers are targeted to the poor, we should be very careful that it should not be a service, a poor service. Even though it is targeting the poor, it should not be a poor service. We also see interactions at national level where we have different civil society organizations engaging on the policy and legal interventions. This is often a tedious and long process, sometimes with results, sometimes without. Civil society organizations that are working on constitution review processes and other legal processes at national level know the pain of engaging in legal and policy advocacy. It can even span 20 years, like in the Kenya situation where the constitution review process took over 20 years. So when you're given a cycle of grant by a donor who expects results in 5 years, it becomes unnecessary pressure for the civil society organization because it's beyond your control to make sure that the constitution is passed in 5 years or a law is passed within a specific year. And we are seeing the grants that we are getting are becoming smaller and reduced. You know, you even have grants for 6 months, grants for 2 years, grants for 1 year. So you're always like chasing this dream that does not happen. So I think my message to our partners is that let's be realistic in terms of expectations with what we can do. But you know, such long processes is where really the change is, because once these rights are enshrined in a constitution, then you know that it is there for sustainability. Another interaction is the negotiation process that we see at the global or regional agenda, including the SDGs or the MDGs that were there, or the 2063 agenda of the Africa Union, for example. There's always a disconnect between the resources and the time we spend in coming up with these frameworks and raising awareness on these frameworks when they are passed. I remember when the SDGs were coming to an end in 2015, there are communities in Kenya who had never heard of what MDGs are. So the resources and the time we spend in building these frameworks, we should, include the same resources. We should devote the same resources to raise awareness to the citizen in very distant places to make sure that they also understand and know what is happening at the global level. Just an answer to Daniela. I think for civil society organizations, what we have seen is evidence-based advocacy works. We need to strengthen communities to come up with data and information that can inform policy. We need to build the capacity of communities to respond, to bring this data up to policymakers. Being in New York this week, I have seen Amazon trying to, stopping the idea of setting up a headquarters in New York. And that is because of community action. I mean, one aspect of it is communities are resisting it. And I think when our communities are able to stand up for their rights, that's when we know that civil society, we have made a difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ms. Mudora, for highlighting the role of civil society at all levels, from the local to the global.